Hello, I'm Anna Bogutskaya, and I'm delighted to be in conversation today with some of the writers of this year's BIFA nominated films. I'll be talking to the screenwriters who are all nominated for a BIFA for debut screenwriter, the category that recognizes a British screenwriter for their debut fiction feature film. We'll be talking about their inspirations, their writing process, and about their experiences of working on their respective debut films. So I'm joined today by Prano Bailey-Bond, the writer-director of Censor, Cathy Brady, the writer-director of Wildfire, Aleem Khan, writer-director of After Love, and Reggie Yates, the writer-director of Pirates. We've got an almost full house of nominees, missing only Marley Morrison, who is also nominated for her film Sweetheart, but isn't able to join us today, sadly, because she is filming her next project. Curious with filmmakers, with screenwriters and directors, kind of how and when did the idea for your film first materialize? Was it a particular line or a scene or a character that came to you? Cathy, can we start with you?
Well, mine's kind of very unconventional. The idea started with Caston first. So I had worked with the two actors separately, Mika and Nora Jane, and it was really to do with their incredible range. And I was just so fired up about what I could do with them. And not only that, what would happen if they actually met each other. So it really began with a conversation. And I just sat back and I was like, holy shit, what is this? And I think it was one of those moments in life that you don't get that often, where you just know that you're destined to kind of to meet these people together, make something together. And it really started there. And I was like, what kind of films do you want to make? What kind of characters? And what was coming back was complicated women. And we sat on that for a while, and we wanted to make a story with fierce women at the heart of it, and not shave the edges.
Prano, Aleem, do you want to jump in with your origin stories for your films?
For me, it was really it started from kind of a question that I just had about identity and how we construct our identities and who we construct our identities for, was kind of this question that I was just sitting with for such a long time. And really that was the spark, that was the kind of the impetus to kind of to write a story that would explore that question. And I knew that I wanted, to write a story that centered on a Muslim character, ideally one that would kind of represent and resemble my own mother, who is a white Muslim convert. I just not seen that kind of representation, that sort of character on screen before in cinema. And I wanted to explore that. I wanted a woman, kind of a Muslim character, to be the center of her story. And we so seldomly see those sorts of characters. I wanted to explore that question, I guess, with the kind of, through the dynamic of a character that was inspired by my own mum.
How did you know when the script was finished and you were kind of, you know what, I'm ready to shoot. Now is the time. I can't write this anymore. Reggie started laughing. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, is it ever finished?
Ever finished.
Everyone can agree that, even when you're on set, you're sort of thinking, I might have done this slightly different if I had more time. I think one of the moments of solace I've taken in talking to way more experienced directors since rapping is that, everybody has said the same thing, and that is, you'll never have enough time, you'll never have enough money. And when you're making a movie, as we all have done in the independent sector for not very much, it is definitely difficult because your time is, this much. And I'm sure we've all sort of experienced that desire to have more time or more room to play and experiment. But unfortunately, it's just not the case when you're on the clock and you're working to a tight budget.
Did you allow for space for improvisation and for adding into what was on the page already?
And my best experiences as director in my short films was learning that I didn't know everything and learning that the actors could really surprise me. So some of my favorite moments have been an actor delivering a line that was different to the way that I always heard it when I was writing it. And it pained me to admit that I preferred their reading than what was in my head, or the extra sort of tweak or change that they made. And I'm just so thankful that I was able to make short films prior to my feature, because there were so many things that I learned on the job that really changed the way that I attack things on set as a feature writer director.
Yeah, I think creating creating space for those surprises is really essential, and it can be quite hard when you're running out of time. But I think if an actor ever asks you, let me try something, you'd be an absolute fool to say to not allow them. I mean, that would just not be a good idea. Always create that space, always find the time to give them the take to do the thing that they want to do, because you're right, so often, and this happened in After Love as well, Joanna wanted to try something, and at the end it's like, just do whatever you want to do, and she would bring out like a completely different energy or a layer, and that was great because we'd have all these other takes, and then in the edit, when you're kind of piecing it together, that one take where she tries something slightly different actually just gives it a different color, and it can really help you in the edit as well to have that variation.
So I remember asking up front, could I have 5 weeks with the actors, because I wanted them to be involved with costume, with their props, with and I wanted them to work on their accent. And I think too often, when the budget's tight, like the actors just come in a week or 2 weeks, and it's quite difficult to kind of work out those kinks in scenes, and try in a scene with a different tempo, with a different color.
I did exactly the same thing, and I think flagging that to your producer at the beginning is really wise. It's what I did too. It was like right at the start of the process, working with Helen, I said, I want to rehearse and I want to shoot on film, because I knew if I went in with that later, it would have just been spanners in the works. But I found the rehearsals really helpful from a writing perspective as well, to just go in, work through the scenes, and I'd start to notice if, for example, I had like a double beat of something, or maybe I needed to find another way of coming out of the scene that was going to work better for performance.
I found the edit to be possibly the most surprising part of writing in a lot of ways, because you can put action lines in your script that require a performance or require a beat from an actor, but in the edit you find other things in coverage that do that in a better way, or that reveal a different part of the character that maybe the actors found that you didn't in your writing. And the edit, for me, I didn't expect it to be as vital a part of writing, or as educational a part for my writing, as it ended up being, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. The edit was actually my favorite part of the whole process, and I think that's because
it wasn't cold.
It wasn't cold. I had time. I think like the edit's a weird time period, because you're kind of grieving certain things that you didn't get, and when you're shooting, so much is taken out of your control, like schedules change, or the weather changes, or something doesn't turn up, or whatever. But in the edit, you can't always you don't get to choose what cards you're dealt, but you get to decide how you want to assemble them and piece them together again.
How do you take on board all these notes, feedback, or being in a rehearsal space and seeing actors deliver a line that maybe doesn't land, that you were really, really in love with, that you really hoped really landed? Like, how do you take on board this constant process of rewriting and feedback and notes from producers, from your collaborators, from your actors, from executives?
Screenwriters love notes, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
The most fun thing in the world, note session, isn't it?
For me, this experience was the first time I've gone through a development process with, execs. We had 3 different sort of sets of notes coming in from Film for the BIFA and Film Wales, and I'd never been through that process before. On my shorts, most of them had been independent. I'd done a couple with financiers, so it was something I had to kind of get used to and get my head around. And through the process of doing it, I think I've learned to trust that a lot more, and trust my own instincts in terms of what you should take on board and what you should dig into a little bit more.
I think there's sometimes I feel like there's a feeling where kind of execs are kind of seen as this evil thing that give you notes. Like, I always find that I had such a great experience with Eva and Natasha, who are my execs at BBC and BFI. And, these are people who read scripts every single day and who are involved in your project because they really care about it. And like, we had loads of notes over the years that we were kind of that I was writing, but for me it was always taken with a kind of love, because it was, I mean, sometimes it was frustrating because I was like, actually, I've really said what I want to say here, and I don't want to open that up again because I'm really sure. But I would always receive the notes respectfully and happily, you know, because if there's a way of improving the work, then that can only be a good thing. But I think there does come a point where there is a limit. But yeah, I think you kind of reach it together, and then, you know, they're either going to give you the money or they're not.
For me, if I'm speaking really honestly, I do think there was a moment during the edit where I did feel like the notes were sending the film in a wrong direction. So the film, I felt, lost its way. And then that was the next journey, was about finding the film that needed to be made through what I wanted to make originally, finding the way back to that point.
Was there something that that you guys were definitively protective about, something that you were adamant would need to remain, that was kind of the seed of the story? Prano, you mentioned before that kind of you feel like your main obligation is always to the story. Did you feel in your stories, in your scripts, in your films, that there was something that you would just not let anyone change or give a note on, that was the thing that you would protect above everything else?
The thing that comes to mind is that there is an element of ambiguity at the end of my film, and at one point the execs kind of said, do you not think you should tie up these ambiguous elements? And I sat and I explained to them exactly why I didn't want to do that, and they said, we completely understand, and we want to support you in telling the story in this way. And I even remember we had a test screening of the film with like a big group of strangers. It was terrifying. And some of the reactions were about that, were like, so ... you know, what's the kind of neat little bow of this aspect of the story? And I remember one of my execs turning around and just saying, we're never going to make you do that. We totally understand why.
The cultural aspects, the religious aspects of Mary's practice, I was very protective of. And no one asked me, it wasn't like execs were asking for anything different, but when I was writing, it was really important to see this woman pray and see the whole prayer, and without cutting. I feel like in films, you know, when we see Muslim characters, we see them pray for, like, they do that and then we cut, and it's just to establish that they're Muslims, and then like we move on. And I really wanted to sit in that space and just like one frame and just allow the audience to see this woman practice her faith. It's a really beautiful act, that prayer, and it has a greater meaning with the other kind of rituals that she has in her life. So allowing space and actually just allowing that take to run through was important for me.
Yeah, for me, I was battling to maintain an edge for my lead characters. Pirates is about these 3 18-year-old boys who are on pirate radio in North London, and they're very likable. In fact, they're quite lovable. And there was this back and forth about how much teeth we can give the boys, which I was battling to ensure that they still had an edge, because being likable doesn't mean being a big old marshmallow on legs. You know, I needed these boys to feel real. And, you know, I've spoken a lot in the promo that we've been doing about the film, about the fact that, you know, there have been so many movies set in this world that rely so heavily on trauma, whereas ours is centered around joy. It's not about some sort of existential crisis or, you know, some horrible gang member or a gun or a knife. It's about young men just being young men who happen to be of color. So it was a bit of a back and forth in terms of how we would do that. And I definitely dug my heels in on several occasions. And as a result, I think that we got where we needed to get to in terms of making sure that these boys felt human, and also as though they still had some sort of edge and teeth with it, you know?
And it's interesting that you all also, you mentioned it before, kind of directed your own scripts, but I'm wondering, do you see yourselves writing scripts for other directors or directing other screenwriters' projects without inputting or writing the script yourselves?
I write a lot, and I've continued to write other things that I feel as though other people can direct and probably should. But in terms of some of the more personal projects, I can't imagine anyone directing them for me from this point. Are you guys the same? I mean, do you feel connected to the things that you write?
I could never give anything that I wrote to someone else to direct.
Yeah.
I just wouldn't, I don't know. But directing someone else's writing, I've not done that, to be honest. And it's a thing that I think about, you know, in the career going forward. Writing is so hard and it's so long. And I'm very much a kind of one thing at a time kind of person. Like I literally spent 5 years just working on After Love with some like little bits in between. So it was really my full-time life. So it's really the idea of like working, like directing someone else's writing is quite appealing, because then you can make a living and also have a bit more brain freedom. But yeah, so I'd certainly be more open to kind of maybe co-writing with someone. But I think fundamentally, I just want to write and direct my own material.
I think that's it. Writing takes such a long time and it's so hard, exactly what you just said. So why would you do that and then give it to someone else to direct? To me, that just, it feels like, I don't know, the reason I write is so that I can direct the film. But I have, in my short films, I've directed scripts that have been written by other writers. But in terms of the process, I feel like I get so much more out of it if I'm heavily involved in the development of the project, because I think you're kind of building so much of the world and so many ideas and building the characters and what you want to explore and say, that kind of all sort of feeds you and feeds into the work. So for me, that process is so important for me. But if, you know, an amazing script that I fell in love with landed in my inbox, I mean, I'm always waiting for that moment that a script will land in my inbox and I'll just be like, wow, this is, you know, the next Charlie Kaufman or something. I'm on it. Then yeah, I'd be open to that, definitely.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's, I mean, I find writing incredibly hard. And I'm like you, I wrote so I could direct, but also so that I could collaborate with the actors. I think TV has taught me to direct script. I think in terms of next feature, I mean, I'm really curious about collaborating with a writer, if that's possible, or is it the dream scenario where something comes into my inbox and off I go? But I don't know if I could sort of imagine something and then give it away, because it's so much of your visualization and directing is wrapped in that as well. So
thank you guys so much for your time. I just have one last question really to wrap up our conversation today. What advice would you give yourself or aspiring young screenwriters if they're starting to work on their first feature film length script?
I think if I could go back a few years when I basically sort of didn't have a huge amount of confidence as a writer, I saw myself as a director first. I would tell myself that it's a craft that you learn, you know, but at the same time, not to get too tied down to the craft, if that makes sense, not to get tied down to the kind of rules, but also to really learn and understand structure, because that's what I think has kind of built my confidence as a writer over the years and allowed me to, well, become a writer.
Yeah, to jump off on that, I think like so much of writing isn't the actual act of pen to paper. For me, writing, so much of the writing process is about being in the location, thinking about the imagery, thinking about the sound. Yeah, but like the actual writing of it is it's a big part, obviously, but there's try and find other ways to access in through the sound and through the imagery. And ultimately write what you're excited about.
Yeah, definitely.
Too long.
To bolt onto that, I think it's really important to leave your fingerprints on whatever it is that you write. Nobody wants to be mayonnaise. I think you have to be willing to throw yourself into it in its entirety. And by that, I mean, don't be scared to make it yours. People talk a lot about finding your voice, which means everything and nothing, because if you're not actually writing, how are you able to discover that? And for me, a combination of doing the work and just writing as much as possible has allowed me to recognize the things that I'm drawn to in terms of how I tell stories. So I think it's incredibly important to not shy away from what it is that you do and the way that you do it, and sort of lean into convention, because, you know, your uniqueness will really start to create that thing that everybody talks about, which is voice. So
to myself, and maybe writers who are just starting out with their debut screenplay, is it possibly is going to take longer than you think to actually get it made. So you got to be crazy passionate about that story, because you could be with that story with like some of us here, 5 years, 6 years. So find a story you can grow into, and have patience.
That's all we have time for today, unfortunately. Thank you so much, Cathy, Prano, Aleem, and Reggie, for your time, your insights, and your films. Join us on BIFA's Instagram on the 5th of December for highlights from the ceremony, red carpet interviews, and the all-important winner announcements.